Much, Kevin.
My pleasure.
Let me share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
There we go.
Great. Awesome. And just so I know, can viewers, can attendees use the chat?
Yes, we can all use chat.
Awesome. Great. Okay, great. So let's get right into it. I'm just rearranging my screen so I can see the chat. I want to be able to take questions as they come in. So I will do my best to keep that visible on my screen so that we can answer your questions as they come up. We're going to be talking today about what's new in Azure SQL. And many of you are probably aware that we say something like we move at the speed of the cloud. And what that means is that we ship stuff all the time, new stuff to all of the Azure SQL deployment options. We'll talk at the beginning to remind everyone what it actually is that I'm talking about when I say Azure SQL. We'll talk about those updates. I'm going to demo some of the things I think are kind of neat. Some things are small that I'm going to demo, and some things are pretty sizable, like the new migration experience. But we're going to try to touch on all of that. I'm going to share resources so you can stay up to date and not have to kind of look for this session. You can just stay up to date on your own. I know people are always asking me, how do I stay up to date with everything that's changing in the cloud and everything that I need to learn? So I'll give some tips and resources at the end. Just a tiny bit about me. I work at Microsoft on the Azure Database Platform team. So our team builds, so we have the engineering and PM side of building out all of the database services at Microsoft. So SQL Server, Azure SQL, Cosmos DB, and as well as our open source databases, as well as our Azure Arc deployment option. So if you have questions about any of those things, you are welcome to shoot them my way. If it's not something I have the answer to, I ask that you shoot me a message on LinkedIn, Twitter, or I can also share my email address and I can find the answer to your question. I don't have all the answers, but chances are I can find someone who knows the answer to any question you might have. Okay, so all that being said, before we get into talking about each of the areas that has updates, I wanted to start by just reminding everyone and kind of bringing us all together on what it is I'm talking about when I say Azure SQL. So Azure SQL was kind of like a branding initiative we came out with a couple of years ago, where we said any deployment offering that's kind of located in Azure that contains that SQL Server engine, we're going to refer to as being part of the Azure SQL family. And there's really three main deployment options for that here. The first is SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. So this is exactly what it sounds like. It's just SQL Server running on a virtual machine hosted in Azure. So you pick the version, you pick the OS, you pick all that, but you're also responsible for things like upgrading and a lot of the things that come with managing a SQL Server. Now, we see a lot of customers kind of just lift and shift or fail over to this. It's a really great way to easily migrate to the cloud and start to get some benefits associated with that. And I'll talk about some of those as we get into the rest of the session. But to give a high-level overview, we're always working on making the SQL VM kind of portal experience easier to use and easier to configure. But that's what we call infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. Now, if we move across the kind of services we offer and say, yeah, you know what, I don't need access to the OS, let's just abstract that away and give me a managed SQL Server. Well, that's where Azure SQL Managed Instance comes into play. This is a platform as a service, or PaaS, so this means you don't have to worry about things like availability, and you also don't have to worry about upgrades because this is versionless SQL. This is also going to have all those instance scope capabilities that you might be familiar with working from SQL Server, like Service Broker, DTC, Database Mail, Machine Learning Services, SQL Server Agent. Hopefully these are sounding familiar. If not, that's okay. That means you might not use them, or you might not need them. Or maybe you're thinking about building a new application, which is where Azure SQL Database is a great option. We say this is best for new apps in the cloud, and this is where a lot of our innovations land first. So you'll see this maybe as a theme throughout the session, but a lot of innovations land first in Azure SQL Database and then to Azure SQL Managed Instance, because we can just roll things out much more quickly as opposed to being on like a several year ship cycle with SQL Server. Azure SQL Database also has Hyperscale and Serverless options available, so we'll talk a little bit about what those are and the updates specifically in that area. So hopefully this is helpful. Again, feel free to put questions in the chat. I can see it. And let's get into the updates. So I wanted to start with what's new in SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. And by the way, I didn't say this at the beginning, but you might be saying, okay, like how far back is she going? Like, is she going back 2 weeks? Like what's going on? So I'm going to give all the updates starting in January of this calendar year. So hopefully that helps give some insight. So for SQL Server on Azure VMs, you can see there's not a ton here listed as like a public preview or a general availability kind of solution or news update. One thing is Azure Defender for SQL. So this is available in SQL Server, in Azure SQL Managed Instance, in Azure SQL Database, and we recently made this available for SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines as well. So you can actually access these things like vulnerability assessment and threat detection right from the Azure portal with Azure Defender for SQL. So this has been a big one, and you might be wondering, like, what has the VM team been up to? There's not a lot of updates here. The reason is there actually are updates. They just aren't kind of expressed as like new features. So if you go in the portal today and you go through the deploy experience for SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine, you'll see that it is always changing. We're basically reacting to feedback that we get on a daily, weekly, monthly basis from customers and updating that workflow to make it a little bit easier for folks to use. So though I don't have a strict list of updates for that piece, just go deploy, try to configure a SQL VM, and you'll see that we've added a lot of things that include the kind of built-in experience so you can get the SQL Server best practices very easily when you're deploying a SQL Server on an Azure VM. All right, moving right along, we're going to talk about what's new in Azure SQL Managed Instance. You can see there's a lot more stuff here. So I'm going to go through this stuff for public preview, then general availability. A lot of this stuff you're going to see, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be also available in Azure SQL Database. So I'll try to call that out as I can. So let's start with public preview. So long-term retention is something that's been in Azure SQL Database for a while. This is something we went public preview with a few months ago for Azure SQL Managed Instance. So this is where we kind of like, we might bring it to Azure SQL Database first, and then we're going to close the gap and bring it to Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance. This is a great example of this. Long-term retention allows you to keep backups for up to 10 years. Then maintenance windows. This is something that came to both Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. This essentially allows you to select when you would like maintenance to occur. So of course, you're not responsible for upgrades and updates, but at a certain point, we might do some updating of your database. And before it was just, you didn't know when these updates were happening, but now with maintenance windows, you can kind of specify if you want this to happen like during the weekday, during business hours, which might not work for most applications, during night during the weekdays, or during night during the weekend. So you can kind of pick based on the workload that you're seeing for your Azure SQL Database or Managed Instance when the best time for this maintenance to occur is. Log replay service, cross-instance message exchange with service broker, cross-instance distributed transaction. These are all things and efforts from the team to kind of bring all of the capabilities from SQL Server to Azure SQL Managed Instance. And log replay service is something we're seeing a lot of customers are using to actually do a migration, like an online migration using this log replay service. And a few other things here in the public preview. Azure Active Directory only auth became available recently in public preview for both Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Just to explain what this is, so if you think about it, if you've ever deployed an Azure SQL Managed Instance or an Azure SQL Database, you always deploy with a SQL admin. So basically you deploy with an SA equivalent account or sysadmin account. You name it something else, but you have to deploy with a SQL login. Well, what this changed is that you no longer have to deploy with a SQL login. You can configure it with Azure Active Directory login by default from the beginning, or after you deploy, you can disable that sysadmin login or SQL admin login, and you can switch it to Azure Active Directory only. So that was what happened with that preview. It's still in preview today to the latest of my knowledge. Then increased storage limit of 16 terabytes. This was a big ask from a lot of our customers who want to get past the 4 to 8 terabyte limit that exists today for managed instance. So 16 terabytes is in general purpose today in public preview, and we will be continuing this trend for the business critical service tier. We haven't explicitly announced that yet, but it is something we are working on. Get that question a lot, so I just wanted to get out in front of it. And then something that just landed a few weeks ago, I was actually just looking this up before, is that it used to be for Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, your differential backup frequency was not configurable. We said it was between 12 to 24 hours, depending on the size of your database and the service tier that you're operating in. But now we are enabling you to kind of change the differential backup frequency so you can have a little bit more control over the storage costs associated with this. So by default, it's going to be 12 hours, but you can now change it to 24 hours if you like. You should note that if you change it to 24 hours, this could potentially make any point in time restores take a little bit longer. All right, so let's move to the general availability side. So some things that happened right at the beginning of the year, maybe even the end of 2020, honestly, is machine learning services. This became available in Azure SQL Managed Instance for R and Python support, and bringing your own custom runtime. Bringing your own custom runtime is a big one for me. If you haven't played with this, there's an extension in Azure Data Studio called the Machine Learning Extension. Makes it super easy to manage packages, deploy models, and kind of train your models and that sort of thing. So that's something to check out. Greatest and least T-SQL functions are things that came to general availability in Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. This is interesting. Like, I haven't been in the SQL space, I guess, only a few years, but adding like new T-SQL capabilities like this is something I haven't seen a ton of in my time on the team, but this is a cool one. I actually have a demo of it. I'll show you in just a second. Another thing we announced for SQL DB and MI is granular permissions for dynamic data masking. So maybe you're familiar with this capability. It's available not only in Azure, but also in SQL Server. But with Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, there is a blade in the portal that makes this a little bit easier, almost like a wizard. And with granular permissions, you can go more granular than just saying, you know, someone has masked access or someone has a certain access. You can actually specify at a more granular level what people are masking versus not, and what rows or whatever is being masked. So this is something to look into. We did do a data exposed episode on this. A side note, a lot of the things that we talk about here land on Data Exposed. If you haven't heard of it, we will talk about it at the end of the show, but it's basically a show I run on YouTube to help everyone stay up to date with what's going on. All right, let's talk about a few other things here. I'm not going to go through all of these. Parallel backups was a big one because it's going to help improve your backup performance. And then we've added some new things for you to troubleshoot connectivity. Connecting to Azure SQL Managed Instance for the first time is always, not always, but is a lot of times something people struggle with, customers struggle with, because you have to either enable the public endpoint, which a lot of people don't want to do, or you want to make sure you have access to the virtual network that the managed instance is located in. So this Azure Resource Health Blade is going to really help people with that. All right, let's take a look at a demo. I told you about the greatest and least functionality, so maybe you want to see it in action. Okay, so what do we have here is I'm in Azure Data Studio. I'm connecting to an Azure SQL Managed Instance with the AdventureWorks database. And essentially, let's say we want to return the maximum account balance for each customer. So whether it's checking, savings, or brokerage, I don't care. I just want to return the value that is the highest, right? So for all of these, we can take a look at what those would be. Now, prior to greatest and least, we could use this kind of searched case expression where we're using like when and thens to get a kind of result and understand which one has the greatest. Or we could use cross apply. Maybe some of you are familiar with this method to do that. But with greatest and least, we're simply just making it easier to do that. You can just use the greatest functionality and say select is the greatest balance, and we're going to get the same results without having to write all that, not necessarily like super complex T-SQL, but relatively complex T-SQL when you compare it to just using the greatest function. So that's one very quick demo, hopefully interesting, that I wanted to show you of something that's new in Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. And now we're going to switch to talking about what's new in Azure SQL Database. I'm not going to go through all of these because a lot of them, like you might notice, do have overlap with what we saw for Azure SQL Managed Instance. A few things I did want to call out is that blockchain support in Azure SQL Database was released at Microsoft Build back in May. This technology is so fascinating. We're essentially enabling Azure SQL databases, whether they're existing or new, to enable blockchain capabilities in their database. So basically giving you ledger capabilities where you can essentially prove the data has not been tampered with. So this is really cool to me because it's like we're bringing the power of blockchain to Azure SQL without you having to worry about the complexity of Azure SQL blockchain. That's called SQL Ledger. It's in public preview today. Let's see, a few other things. Query store hints was another big one that was very interesting. This is going to allow you to basically supply query store hints, and then you won't have to go rewrite any queries if you want to fix something specific. All right, from the general availability side, Azure SQL Auditing went GA now a long time ago, probably six or 7 months ago. But this was a big deal because this means you can now audit to not just blob storage, but log analytics, Event Hub. And with the GA, we announced this idea of auditing Microsoft operations. So what this means is that if you open a support case with Microsoft and Microsoft gets any sort of access to your database, you can now audit that using this capability. So that was a big one. Let's see what else. Always encrypted with secure enclaves was another really big one. So always encrypted with secure enclaves was something we shipped in SQL Server 2019. However, due to the lack of the proper hardware in Azure, we have only recently been able to make that available for Azure SQL Database. Now that the hardware is available, we went through the public preview and the GA since the start of this year. So that's something to check out. Private link for Azure Data Sync just went GA a couple weeks ago. That's basically going to, if you're using Azure SQL Database with a private endpoint, you can now also use Azure SQL Data Sync. From a learning perspective, we launched 2 new learning paths on Microsoft Learn. One is around building serverless full stack applications in Azure. So if you want to learn more about serverless architectures or serverless types of solutions, this is the way to go. This is talking about serverless databases, but it also goes into serverless functions and logic apps and Azure Static Web Apps. So it's a really great way to learn about some of the various serverless architectures and services in Azure. And then one that myself and Silvano just released last week is deploying IoT solutions with Azure SQL Database. So this was, we've seen a lot of customers kind of use these patterns to deploying IoT solutions. And so we templatized it out and we released it as a Learn module. So you can actually use the template for free and deploy all these Azure resources to play with it. But you can also use the template for, at scale and customize it to whatever IoT solutions you want to build. So that was pretty exciting. And that's based on Hyperscale. So that also gives you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about Hyperscale if you would like. All right, then. Okay, so in Azure SQL Database, there are 2 more things that are newer. And I had mentioned this earlier, and that's Hyperscale and Serverless. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about these. So I'll start with Serverless. If you haven't heard of Serverless before, this essentially allows you to set a minimum and a maximum amount of CPUs or compute that you want. And the service will auto scale you on a per second basis to the max of CPU or memory that you need at any given moment. So this is awesome from a price performance perspective because you aren't having to over provision and then overpay, but then be protected when you have a high workload, or under provision and try to save costs. But then when you have some sort of unexpected workload, you get throttled. This is going to just auto scale you for exactly what you need. So that's pretty cool. And the other thing that serverless does as it optionally, you can implement an auto pause delay. So for example, if you set an auto pause delay of 1 hour after no one uses the database, we essentially separate the compute from the storage, and you only pay for the storage during this time. So this can be huge cost savings because the compute is usually the more expensive bit anyways. We've seen huge adoption of this. So definitely worth checking out Azure SQL Database Serverless. If you have any questions about it, happy to take those. The next thing, and so what's new in the serverless space is zone redundancy. So zone redundancy is something we brought to Azure SQL Database general purpose service tier, business critical service tier first. And essentially what it does is it allows you to, instead of having all your copies in one data center in one disk or whatever, we're going to spread that across a region. So you might not know what region we're spreading it across, but it's essentially going to give you one more layer of protection with zone redundancy. So we're slowly working on rolling this out to all of our tiers of Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. So you'll see that kind of go around as well. Speaking of different redundancy, the other type of redundancy you have is for your backup specifically. Now for Azure SQL Database, you have the option to pick how you want your backups to be stored. So you can have your backups stored with zone redundant, or you can have them stored as geo redundant, or you can have them stored as locally redundant. So locally redundant would be it's all on the same kind of all on the same node. Zone redundant would be it's all in the same region, but there's copies spread across the region. And then geo redundancy would be it's in different regions around the world. So storage redundancy options are for your backups, and this is something that we're bringing to Hyperscale. So again, already available in Azure SQL Database, but we're bringing it to the Hyperscale tier. And with Hyperscale, similar to what you saw with Managed Instance, we're kind of trying to bridge the gap between capabilities that exist in Azure SQL Database today. And that's what you see with a lot of these things. TDE with bring your own key support, geo replication, and database copy are all things that have been available in Azure SQL Database for a while. And so with Hyperscale, we're just kind of bringing that there. Now, the one thing that is new, net new in Hyperscale is named replicas. Named replicas are really interesting because what it allows you to do is essentially create replicas on the fly. So it's not a size of data operation. You can say, hey, I have this big workload. I'm going to create a replica. I'm going to create it with a different compute than the primary. I'm just going to use it when I need it, and then I'm going to, get rid of it. I can put it in a different server, and I can put it in with a different name. So that's why they're called named replicas, because you can actually name them. So I thought like a cool demo might be to show you all the different replica types in the Hyperscale tier and how Hyperscale is really going to enable some serious read scale or analytics type of workloads. Okay, so here we are looking at a Hyperscale database. You can see that there. It's currently 16 vCores. It doesn't say the storage on this page you're seeing here, but we can go into compute and storage to take a little bit closer look at the details. So what we're seeing is that we're using Hyperscale. We can see it's 16 cores, and we have this idea of high availability secondary replicas. So this is going to help you increase your SLA. You can also use them for read scale, but you're not really going to know which one you're connecting to. Like if you have 4, you're not going to know which one you're connecting to. So then if we go into actual replicas, what we're going to see are 2 types of replicas. First, we're going to see just like our primary. So this is going to list like our high availability replicas. You see right now I just have 1. And then we have Geo Replicas, which is currently in preview today. And this allows you to have one other replicated database in another region with the same number of virtual cores. So you can see it's 16 like the original. Now let's go create a named replica. So what I'm going to do is create a named replica in the same region, but I'm allowed to give it whatever name I want, and I can put it in any server I want as long as it's in that same region. The next thing I can do is I can actually configure the compute that is required for whatever workload I need. So let's say I'm going to do some crazy reporting and analytics, and I actually need 80 cores. I'm no longer constrained to the primary compute. I can add whatever compute I want, and vice versa. If I only needed 2 vCores for this, I could do that. Now this is going to give me a readable replica, and what you're going to see is it deploys in like a couple minutes, even though the database itself is about 13 terabytes in size. So we're not tying it to the size, and that has to do with the hyperscale architecture. Now, once this is created, we can go down into replicas, and we should be able to see, once this loads, that we now have 2 named replicas. That was the one we just created, and it's actually 80 vCores. So this is really cool. And then when I'm done with it, I can just delete it, and it doesn't do anything to my availability SLA or my primary at all. So again, just thought that was kind of an interesting one to show off named replicas. Now, when we talk about named replicas, you can currently have up to 30 of them. So if you think about it, you could have 30 named replicas, you can have 1 geo replica, and you can have 4 high availability replicas. So you could have 35 readable replicas, which is just like a lot of read scale. So definitely something to check into if that is a workload you're looking at, or you have some sort of high transaction analytical processing that you're doing. All right, finally, so we talked about what's new in SQL VMs, SQL Managed Instance, and SQL Database. There are a few things that are available across Azure SQL. That includes Azure Defender for SQL, which I mentioned came most recently to Azure SQL VMs. And it also includes Azure Monitor Sql Insights. Now, this is something new that we've been working on, and I thought instead of kind of talking through it, again, I love demos, and I did pre-record some of these in advance, so it makes it a little bit easier for me, but I thought it would be better to kind of walk through a scenario using SQL Insights. So here what I'm doing is I'm using OStress to essentially create a workload on a Azure SQL database that I have. And let's just say for the purposes of this demo that this workload is taking way longer than I need it to take. So I need it to take less time. So what I want to do is I want to investigate why it's taking so long. So once the workload completes, then we can kind of go into Azure Monitor for SQL Insights. So we can see it took 42 seconds. So just remember that 42 seconds is how long it took. So now we can use Azure Monitor SQL Insights, which is a new experience that we've created, just released in public preview in March, that's going to allow you to monitor across all your Azure SQL estate. So this is the main view in the Azure portal. You can see that I have a monitoring profile and I have a time range that I can specify. There are some other things I can do here, and I can basically have an agent that's connecting to all of these servers and databases. In the overview, I'm able to see all of my databases and instances and even my SQL servers on Azure Virtual Machines. And if I had AGs configured, I would also see those here, but I have not done that. You can also see I have some alerts, and that might be related to what we just saw, but these alerts, sure enough, are high CPU database percent. And you might be wondering, how hard are these alerts? Well, there are a bunch of templates, and you can see I just used one of the templates, but you can also customize these alerts to kind of create whatever alert rules that you need for your given workload or kind of set of databases or instances. Now I can go and I can click into the Azure SQL database overview, and here I'm going to be able to see a bunch of my different databases that I have, as well as if they're primary or secondary. And then I can start to dive into each of these resources. Now, definitely going to want to check out that one with really high CPU usage. But for now, I wanted to first show you some of the other things that are available. So for example, in activities, I'm able to see like across all of those different servers and databases, what's going on. I might want to check out that one. I can see compilations, all sorts of stuff here. I can also go into database space or transactions, or even to the explore metrics. And you can see I'm just scrolling really fast here, but you can see all the different metrics that we're now making available. So we're kind of bridging the gap between kind of these metrics that you could see in auditing versus metrics you might use in using like some of your standard T-SQL reporting technologies or strategies. So if we go into this database that is getting hit pretty hard with CPU, what I can do is I can kind of dive into it. And you see that CPU utilization over time. You can see I'm kind of hitting the maximum a lot with these workloads that I'm running. Now, if I want to dive deeper into that, what I can do is I can see the SQL weight category. And what I'm seeing is I'm getting throttled a bunch on CPU. And when I click into that, it's actually going to tell me the exact weight type, which in this case is SOS scheduler yield weight, which is usually indicative that I don't have enough CPU resources for the workload I'm trying to run. So this is a great example of how I'm able to kind of diagnose what's going on using Sql Insights. In this case, just to make it easier, I'm just going to scale up the CPUs for this database and see if that helps this workload. So I've scaled up to 8 vCores. Remember, last time it took us 42 seconds for this workload to complete. And now hopefully we'll see that it completes, in 13 seconds, which is much less time. And if we go back to Azure Monitor, which allows us to kind of see in real time, no lag like we saw with some of the other tools in Azure SQL Database before, we can see that CPU utilization has indeed dropped. We're only using 50–60% of the CPU. So that's just a very simple example of how we're able to address potentially a common issue here. But Azure Monitor SQL Insights is very exciting, very cool stuff that we've been working on. And I've done a couple episodes, even a deep dive with the lead PM for this, Elaine Dormel. So if you want to learn more or see more, that would be something to check out after. Okay, so now that we talked about Azure SQL, I thought we should talk about, okay, well, what's new in the migration space? And when I say the migration space, I mean like any way you're trying to move to Azure SQL or you're trying to upgrade. Maybe you're trying to upgrade from SQL Server 2008. Hopefully no one is using SQL Server 2008 anymore, but maybe you are. But from upgrading to a newer version of SQL Server to migrating to Azure SQL, whether it's SQL Server in a VM, Azure SQL Database, or Azure SQL Managed Instance. So some of the recent things that went in public preview, the first one up there, this happened back in March, and this was basically the ability for you to install an appliance on your VMware environment, and then we can scan your whole VMware estate and understand which databases are there, which versions of SQL Server, and assess all of them and tell you where to go, as long as some cost optimizations and insights on how you might want to migrate. Maybe you want to use a different compatibility level, or maybe something needs to go to Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, but some things can go to Azure SQL Database. And then something we just announced at the beginning of September was migrating from Azure Data Studio with a new migration extension, and I have a demo of that, so we'll hold off on that one. For general availability, something that's really interesting is that we are investing heavily in helping you migrate from heterogeneous migration. So we consider that Oracle, DB2, Sybase, other things that are not SQL Server to SQL Server and Azure SQL. So you'll see like almost every month we're updating these tools like SQL Server Migration Assistant, Data Access Migration Toolkit, Data Migration Assistant, always adding stuff here to help you migrate easier. And then finally, I just wanted to mention we had this program called the Azure Migration Program, and we've changed this through the Azure Migration and Modernization Program, because what we've realized, and it seems simple, it's just like a naming thing, but what we realized is that customers are all in different stages of this migration journey. And so we kind of want to be able to meet customers where they are. If they're modernizing, for example, from SQL on a VM to Azure SQL Managed Instance, we want to help them. If they're just migrating from SQL Server to SQL on a VM, we want to help them. So not just migrations, but also kind of modernization efforts. All right. All that being said, I have another demo. Hopefully this is okay with you all the demos. Sometimes I think it's kind of cool to learn what's new by just kind of seeing it in action, as opposed to just me reading it off the slides. Okay, so let me kick this off. I did, full disclosure, pre-record this because some steps take some time. But this is a Tailspin Toys application I have. It's very simple. It has a leaderboard, which is essentially read-only, and then it also has some games. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you that I'm connecting to a local instance of SQL Server. And we can also take a look at that. So here I'm connected to the local instance of SQL Server, and you can see the version that I'm running down there is SQL Server 2008 R2 SP3. So this is the instance we're going to try to migrate. So essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into that Azure SQL migration extension, which you can see, and then I'm essentially going to migrate to Azure SQL. So I'm going to click that, and this is going to take me step by step through the entire process. So I don't have to have track of all those tools. You know, if I don't want to, I can do it all from right here in Azure Data Studio. So you can see I'm able to see the assessment if there's any results, but there's no issues found for Azure SQL Managed Instance or SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. Now I'm simply going to select the subscription and location and resource group and really just the managed instance that I want to migrate to. So I did have to pre-deploy this managed instance, but let's just say I've done that. Now we're going to do an online migration. And essentially we have to make sure our backups are in a network share. So you can see I've got them stored here. And you have to be able to give Azure Data Studio essentially the ability to read this folder. So that's what we're doing here. And then it's going to upload those to a blob storage account. Now, the next thing I need is a database migration database migration service. And you can see I didn't have one created, so I'm essentially just going to create one now. And so a great thing, I don't have to switch over to the portal and create it. I can create it right here. And it's telling me, hey, you are going to need this self-hosted integration runtime. So go here and download it and install it. And again, I've sped this part up because it did take a few minutes. But again, the nice value prop here is like I didn't have to go figure out what to do or anything. I just followed exactly what Azure Data Studio told me. I entered the keys to kind of connect this self-hosted runtime to this database migration service. And then we're pretty much ready to go. I can then kind of check the connection. We can see it's successful. And now I can continue on to the final step, which is just reviewing what has been done, and I can start the migration. So you can see in just a few steps, I was able to kick off this migration, really all from just one tool. Azure Data Studio is just guiding me through. Now we can see that this migration is started. And so what I can do is I can click in to try to see some of those details. So I can see the migration status is creating, and it is an online migration. And now I can see the migration status is in progress. So while that's happening, what I can do is I can actually go and get connected to this Azure SQL Managed Instance, and we can just see you know, like what it looks like. Is the data coming up? And if we make updates on the on-prem SQL Server, are those updates being applied to the SQL Managed Instance? So here I'm just logging into the SQL MI in Azure Data Studio. And then we will be able to see the databases that are there. And you can see that Tailspin Toys is going to kind of remain in this restoring process while the migration is in progress. Because again, this is an online migration. So here I can see in the status that the backup file has been restored. Now let's say, like, since this is an online migration, let's say we want to do something in that on-prem database. So maybe, for example, we want to, maybe we want to add a new game. Let's say we want to add a new game to our application. So here I'm just adding a new game called Space Adventure for the website. And I'm just going to connect to the database and insert this new game. And right now I'm connected to SQL Server, not Azure SQL Managed Instance. So finally, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to back up the log, and this is how we keep that online state. So I'm basically going to back up a log to that file share that database migration service has access to. And then what I'm going to be able to do is, of course, in this is just the SQL Server app, but of course I'm going to be able to see that new game is there. So the new game is in our app. We are continuing to be online per se, but we want to ultimately see if this has also transferred over to our SQL managed instance. All right, so let's just go back. Let's check on that migration. And if we go in, what we're going to see is hopefully that transaction log being uploaded and then backed up. So we can see, yep, the transaction log has been uploaded. And then after a few minutes, it should be restored. But let's say now we're going to kind of perform the cutover. So essentially, we want to wait till the last transaction log has been backed up and restored. And from that point on, we are offline, right? So we want to keep that offline time short, and then we can go ahead and complete the cutover. So essentially, it's going to remind me all the steps that I should take into account when I do this cutover. So stop the incoming transactions, make sure it's been restored and there are no pending backups, and then you can basically like confirm that you did this and complete the cutover. Now the cutover only takes a few seconds. But once the cutover has taken place, then, or even during this cutover, I can go ahead and switch my application connection strings to connect to the Azure SQL managed instance. You can see right now the migration status is completing. We'll give it just a few more seconds to finish. But once it's finished, we can change the connection strings and we can take a look. And this should exit that restoring state, which you see it did. And then if we go into it again, we can kind of refresh it, and hopefully now it will say it has completed. Yep, we see the migration status has succeeded. So the final step is to update the connection strings in our application so that our application is connected to managed instance and not the local SQL server. All right, so one thing we can do, which we had talked about briefly, is to confirm that that new game is there, Space Adventure. And sure enough, we can see that the new game is in Azure SQL Managed Instance. We probably should have checked that earlier, but at least now you know. So now we're going to grab that connection string. We're going to head over to the application. We're going to stop the application, and we're just going to quickly update the connection string and the username to connect to the managed instance instead of to the local SQL server. Now, of course, we did need to configure our virtual network so that we have access to this managed instance from our on-prem environment. But just for the simplicity, I went ahead and connected that in advance. And now we can go ahead and run the application again. And we're going to see, hopefully, that the app is still working and that it does have the Space Adventure game. Now, one thing I wanted to share is that for this migration, I used an Azure SQL Managed Instance Business Critical service tier. So what that means is that behind the scenes, we're deploying an always-on availability group, which means we have 3 replicas at any given time, and one of those can be used for read-only workloads. So you can see there we're using the read-write endpoint, but for our read-only workloads, if I configure my application that way, I can simply add this application intent equals read-only, and that's going to direct all my read-only workloads to the read-only endpoint, and therefore, allowing me to kind of write more or have my read workload not interfere with my primary. So now we just did that simple change in the app. We just want to see if that leaderboard is actually hitting the read-only workload work endpoint, and we can see that it is. So that's just kind of a simple example to see, like, okay, now you're in Azure, you can start to take advantage of things like this built-in availability that comes with Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL in general. So I see there was a question from Kevin. Is this using a backpack in the background? It's actually not using a backpack. What we're doing is we are essentially we're doing an initial backup with the actual back file. And then what we're doing is we're going to back up the transaction log. So you'll keep adding these transaction logs, and then those are being uploaded into an Azure Blob Storage account and then being restored on the managed instance in this case. But that's a good question. Okay, so those are the what's new. Now, a question I often get in this type of session is, okay, but what's next? So this is exciting that I can share this information with you all. We are investing in 5 key areas. So let me just give you a few sneak peeks on what we're thinking. So the first is we want to unify SQL across cloud and on-prem. So the goal here is essentially to blur the lines between cloud and on-prem. So Azure Arc, which is essentially our kind of deploy SQL anywhere kind of product. It basically runs on Kubernetes, any Kubernetes and any cloud. And then you can get things like SQL Managed Instance or Postgres Hyperscale wherever you're running, wherever you have Kubernetes. So we intend to continue to do this and also make services that aren't in Azure more Azure connected and bring you these platform as a service offerings wherever you are. So that's kind of like the all-up vision there. We also want to keep investing in modern development. So you've seen some things with Hyperscale and Serverless today, but we're going to keep investing in modern frameworks like Django. We just released actually something for Django. We're going to invest in other things like Spring Data, modern languages, GraphQL, JSON support, or deeper JSON support. These are all things we're thinking about, and the new IoT module that I was telling you about, including the template, is one example of how we're kind of trying to reach the modern developer. Today we talked about Hyperscale and Serverless, but we didn't talk a ton about elastic pools. This is a way to deploy a bunch of databases essentially that share resources and therefore can help you cost optimize. So one of the visions that we have is take the best of Hyperscale, take the best of Serverless and the best of elastic pools and bring you one unified service that is limitless in size, is able to auto scale and auto pause as needed, and is able to resource share and optimize across a lot of databases. So lots of cool stuff happening in this space. I'm still not sure how that will all shape out, but I'm excited to see what happens. Confidential computing, we talked about always encrypted with secure enclaves. That's something we've delivered on this year already, as well as bringing blockchain to SQL with Azure SQL Database Ledger. We're going to continue to invest in both of these spaces, and we're also investing in Purview. Azure Purview is something that is in public preview, or it went generally available either today or yesterday, I think. It was very recent, became generally available. And this is essentially a way to govern all of your data. So we have plans to have deep integrations with Azure Purview so you can govern all your data regardless of which Azure SQL deployment option it's in. And finally, we're not going to forget about SQL Server. All of these things are based on the SQL engine, and we don't plan to slow down. We plan to keep releasing versions of SQL Server. Unfortunately, I can't share information about when the next version of SQL Server will be, but we have ideas to continue to innovate here in spaces that have never been done before. One example of that is a project where we're rewriting parts of the SQL core engine code to remove static variables with machine learning models that can adapt to your workload at runtime. So this is going to be transformational for us because no other data platform is kind of offering this level of intelligence. So expect a lot of cool things in this space as well, just from the engine itself and SQL Server itself. I know we're getting close to the end of time. I promised you I would tell you how to stay up to date. The two biggest things I'll say is one, aka.ms/news update. That's going to be a very important one. I can put these in the chat. /news update. This is essentially going to be redirected every month to the latest news blog. Every month I do a news blog, which you can see here. Here's the September one. And then you can see all the updates that came out. You can also see all the videos that we release that you might be interested in. For example, if you're looking, you want to learn more about conversion reports in SQL Server Management Studio. Let's see, what else? All the blogs from all different places, you can find them here. We have a lot of blogs and we post a lot of blogs. So if you want to just have a quick scan and figure out what you want to know, you can see all the upcoming events. For example, maybe that's how some of you heard about the Future Data Driven event. And you can see some other things here. So this is a great way to stay up to date. Again, this updates every month, and just so you can see, I'll just skip ahead a little bit. These are all the ones that you can see there every month starting this year. I started this, so we'll see how long I can keep it updated, but it's been very well received. Okay, so let me go back to here. The other main resource I wanted to share with you all is the Azure SQL YouTube page. So I mentioned that I host a show on YouTube called Data Exposed. We stream live every Wednesday morning, and we release recorded short episodes on Thursdays and Tuesdays with MVPs. So you can see we have short episodes about different things, even things like Citus or Azure SQL VMs. There's lots of videos because we do this a lot. We also have Data Exposed Live. I mentioned that on Wednesdays, so you can see different things, including the news updates. Blog always has a video. So if you want to see demos or hear me talk to the PMs about the latest things, that's the place to go. And that's pretty much all on here. You can also follow myself or our team's Twitter account if you want to stay up to date. And then I talked about some ways to learn. These are some great places if you're interested in learning more about Azure SQL overall. So that's a lot. We covered a lot in, this 51 minutes. I also will put up, I think we put up all the other information, but please don't forget to give feedback on this session. I'm always trying to improve myself as a speaker, so I always welcome feedback. I know it's a lot to throw all this news at you, so if you have comments or anything like that about how I could present better, I would really appreciate it. Also, the organizers for the event want to know the feedback that you have for the event and the session. So please don't forget to do that. And, I'll just, as we close, I'll put back up this resources slide. I hope this was useful. I just want to thank you all so much for spending time with me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
And as always, that was awesome. I know I learned a lot about the last year because it's, like everyone knows, it's extremely hard to keep up with Azure, even what's out there, much less what's going to come. So thank you so much for doing all that you do to help everybody, between the news updates, the Data Exposed channel. I swear I see you at least 3 times a week. So
awesome. Thanks so much.